Mr. Levchenko, will the file or the case filed by Ukraine against Russia at the International Court of Justice likely to work and serve the purposes of Kiev?
Well, I believe that Ukraine has all the necessary evidence to show that Russia is the aggressor here, that to show that Russia finances these separatists, and not only finances them but provides them with weapons, to show that Russia is committing terrible crimes against humanity in Crimea, repressing the Tatar population, repressing the Ukrainian population. I think all the evidence required is there. In fact, all this evidence was available over the past 2 years everywhere, on the internet, in all open sources. So I think the majority of the world realizes who is the aggressor here. And what we need with this court case is that we need to create a legal document from an international court, which will clearly show that Russia finances terrorism. And this is why this is such an important court case.
Funding terrorism and also racial discrimination, that's what the case was about against Russia. Mr. Felgenhauer, I understand you're not Russian diplomat nor Russian official, but I'm sure as a Russian scholar, you have your own views.
Well, this court case in The Hague is, of course, basically part of a more kind of PR psychological warfare happening between Moscow and Kiev. It's clear, of course, that this will not have any kind of real legal repercussions. The case will take most likely many years to conclude, if it will be ever concluded. There could be preliminary measures taken by the court in several months, though even if they will be taken, they will not be implemented. But this is important for Ukraine, which is initiated this process, and it's important not just international, it's very important internally in Ukraine for the Poroshenko government, which is not very popular, to show to its people that they're doing something to put pressure on Russia. Even if there's not very effective pressure, at least you can show that something.
All right. Mr. Levchenko, from Russian side, there seems to be accusation that your president has not been very popular, as said by Mr. Felgenhauer, and also has not been able to demonstrate his governance capability to control the whole country. There's still a lot of conflicts going on, even checkpoints being set up by the rebels all the time. If you could see RT reports recently. What do you make of it, Mr. Levchenko? Is your government really capable? Meanwhile, is your government really supported by the majority?
Well, regarding the popularity of our president and the popularity of the current government, I can say myself that they really aren't very popular. I myself am actually part of the opposition, but I'm part of the real opposition, of the national opposition, and not of the so-called opposition bloc, who are actually Russian special operatives working in our parliament. And so the fact that Poroshenko is not popular, or that the government is not popular, does not mean that people who do not like Poroshenko like Putin. These are two totally different ideas, and it's actually quite often that Russian politicians manipulate this fact when they say that the fact that Poroshenko is not popular means that people support the separatists or people support Russia. This is totally not true. People do not support Poroshenko because Poroshenko is actually an oligarch who, instead of fighting this war properly, is giving preferences to himself, his businesses, and to the businesses of his friends such as Akhmetov, Kolomoisky, Firtash, and so on. Which means that our army is not financed properly, which means that our economy is not growing properly, and due to this we aren't able to resist the aggression as good as we should be able to resist it.
Okay.
This is the problem.
We could see.
So most of the people which don't support Poroshenko do not support Putin either.
What about the fact that Mr. Levchenko, that I asked you the second part of the question, which is the government now in your country be able to govern with so many still conflicts going on and checkpoints by the so-called rebels? We don't know even who the rebels are, but the rebels? Briefly.
Well, are you asking me whether the government is able to govern the uncontrolled territories,
yes.
the occupied territories,
yes.
or what is the question?
The question is whether your government is able to govern with many checkpoints still operated by the rebels and with many conflicts still going on right now in your country.
Well, the central government is able to govern those areas of Ukraine which are controlled by the central government.
Okay.
Obviously, the occupied territories are not controlled by the central government, and just by the by, I would like to mention that these are not rebels. These are Russian forces, 90% of them, financed by Russia and actually made up of Russians,
okay.
Of ethnic Russians.
All right,
so of course, the central government cannot control the occupied territories. That's why they're occupied.
Mr. Levchenko, you have a lot of accusations against the Russian side, whether they are in your parliament or your government or in the eastern part of your country. Let's take a look at some of the things that are going on over the past year. The conflict in eastern Ukraine did not stop even after a ceasefire deal was signed in the year 2015, according to the National News Agency of Ukraine. In the first 2 months of 2017, over 100 casualties among civilians in Donbass region. Among them, around 20 people died. And since the Ukraine conflict started in 2014, more than 9,800 people have died. The Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe said on Friday that the rebels have surrounded one of the group's teams near Donetsk, opening fire and seizing a drone they were trying to launch. Of course, the conflict is going on. Mr. Felgenhauer, what about the finger pointing Mr. Levchenko already did earlier in his accusation against the Russia? Operatives everywhere, parliament, the government, and also elsewhere in your country, in Ukraine.
We have already established in this discussion, well, the obvious fact that the present Ukrainian central government is not very popular. And it is not absolutely fully in control of everything that's happening in Ukraine, which is increasingly a problem, because it means that a political, peaceful compromise solution of the Ukrainian crisis seems right now almost impossible, since there's a government in Kiev that can't really impose anything, which if it does, even if it goes for a compromise, it will be accused of selling out to Russia or something like that by more radical forces that would maybe want to have a new snap elections and take over government. Okay. When we don't have actually any real good prospects of political solution, that means there's a strong possibility that there's going to be more military action and maybe even escalation eventually, though I don't think that's going to happen immediately soon.
Well, there are so many things going on right now. There's also talk about what is likely to be the relations, Professor Wang, if you could help us here in Beijing, between Russia and the Western countries, and as a result, its impact on Russia's relations with Ukraine and Ukraine's fate in the future, Mr. Wang. Professor Wang, if you could.
Okay. Well, the
Professor
Russians,
Professor Wang, if you could take a look at the camera right in front of you. Professor Wang.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, China, I think, is not directly involved in that kind of case. So I think we should understand the confrontation of the Ukraine and the Russia from long perspective. Actually, it's not just a bilateral meaning, but also the concern about the relations with Russia, with the NATO expansion, and Russia with the European Union. And the Ukraine government, I think, they eagerly want to join EU or NATO and then bring such kind of disasters. This is, I think, that unfortunately. So we should understand this from a long and a comprehensive perspective. This is my observation.
Mr. Levchenko, I'm sure you have a very different view about why these European countries should be and should not be interacting with Russia. Mr. Levchenko.
I'm still sure that the Western European countries and the US will support Ukraine in its fight against Russian aggression. But what I would like to note here is that one of the problems that we have is that our own government isn't doing as much as it should do in its fight against Russian aggression. And due to this, we constantly get these signals from the West that the sanctions are about to be lifted. Like the sanctions will be lifted tomorrow, after tomorrow, in a couple of months, in a year, and so on. So I'm sure that if our government continues to fight against the aggression as much as possible, then these sanctions will remain in place. Even though, to be honest, these sanctions, they aren't really that problematic for Russia. They're really, in my view, they're really a fraction of what should have been done. And they really aren't creating big problems for Russia as they should have been done.
Well, Mr. Felgenhauer, what would you say? I mean, with Mr. Trump coming into the power, even though there's a lot of controversy, but it seems both U.S. and the Western European countries do have the tendency more interactions with Russia. What would that mean for Ukraine, the country itself, from your perspective?
Well, there was hope after the November American elections in Moscow, and Donald Trump was talking about that there's a possibility of improvement of relations with Moscow, that there was talk of a so-called big deal that could also involve not only the Middle East and many and other areas, and most likely maybe even and also maybe Ukraine, a kind of finding an agreement between Moscow and Washington on different aspects that right now separate the two capitals. Right now, today, it's such a big deal, quote unquote, seems less possible. But there's also the problem that the new Trump administration seems to be rather unruly. Donald Trump has failed up to now, to some extent, to actually build a capable, effective administration, which means he's actually disrupting a lot. The Western alliances, disrupting internal American politics. And this is an environment in which Russia could maybe find ways to find ways of solving the Ukrainian crisis, maybe find ways of better relations with European countries, which was always the Russian main objective.
It's a very interesting point, isn't it, Mr. Levchenko? If I could go to you before I go to the Chinese guest. Mr. Levchenko, I mean, if the Trump administration is politically strong, then it could have better relations with Russia as they hoped in the campaign, and that probably would mean a very questionable fate of Ukraine. However, even if the Trump administration is weak, as it is showing so far politically in Washington, Russia could got the opportunity now to work on issues of Ukraine because nobody else would have the time and the energy. So it seems that none of these scenarios, according to Mr. Felgenhauer, is good for your country. Mr. Levchenko.
Well, once again, I'd like to stress, first of all, regarding the Trump administration, it's far too early for us to judge the true intentions of the Trump administration regarding the war between Ukraine and Russia. It's far too early to judge. Let's wait for 3 months, 4 months, maybe in half a year before we can really say whether or not Trump administration wants to forget about Ukraine and work only with Russia. Because right now, I really do not think that we have enough evidence to say this. In fact, when we look at what's going on in the US Congress and US Senate, we see the opposite of this. We see almost every week new initiatives from the Republican Party in terms of helping Ukraine in its fight against Russia. And the same with Western Europe. There might be talk, especially from new emerging parties, which are not currently in government. Yes, there are certain initiatives regarding being closer to Russia as opposed to being closer to Ukraine, but so far these parties aren't even in government. The current government of France, of Germany, and so on is supporting Ukraine. I think they're not supporting Ukraine as much as they should be supporting Ukraine, and that's the reason for that is because we ourselves, our government isn't doing enough to fight this aggression. If our government was doing enough, then they would be supporting Ukraine even more. But of course, if we aren't doing all that we should do, then it's hard for their politicians to explain to their electorate why they should suffer due to us.
Professor Wang, Ukraine has always been a very tricky issue. Because after all, it seems to be a proxy war that is going on in Ukraine between Russia and some of the other Western countries, including the United States. things change, and then the nature of the issue of Ukraine also changes. Has Ukraine really be able to grasp its own fate in its own hand at any time?
I think it is questionable because for a long time after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Finland and Ukraine, I think the governance is not so good. Economically, politically, corruption is quite serious. Until now, after the Ukraine crisis, Crimea crisis, and the more you rely on the U.S. and the European support. So that this time, I think, suited this case of the Russia is two purposes. One is to remind the U.S. Russia's so-called reconciliation is questionable. Still reminded that Russia is a threat. Secondly, when President Trump urged that the European members of the NATO want to increase the military budget, then some American foundations need Ukraine to suit the Russia, and then to stimulate the NATO members to increase the budget. So that's kind of maybe this game plan.
Very interesting. Mr. Felgenhauer, we all remember the Ukrainian president at the Munich Security Conference. He was on the same panel with John McCain, of course, the senator Republican, also against Russia traditionally, talking about the Western world, quote unquote, should be united behind Ukraine. Have you seen that united front, quote unquote, from the Russians' perspective? And what is Russia going to do you think, smartly politically now with the Ukraine issue, given the current circumstances?
The present situation, it seems like a frozen conflict.
Really?
Such conflicts kind of have been in many parts of the world. I mean, even Korea could be called a frozen conflict. But really freezing the Ukrainian situation, I believe, is almost impossible. Russia does not have the resources, no one has the resources in the region to keep it in the present state. So there should be some kind of solution. And it should be maybe earlier than later. Right now, Russia is trying to use primarily, of course, political means and economic means, and hoping that a more reasonable government appears in Kiev with which we could negotiate what we want from Ukraine. And Russia wants from Ukraine that Ukraine does not become an ally of the West and an ally of NATO. Other parts of the present confrontation are negotiable. Of course, Crimea is not from Russian point of view, but others can. But can that be achieved? Will that be achieved? What will emerge in Ukrainian internal turmoil? Right now, it's very hard to predict. But for the foreseeable future, at least for the coming months, I'm sure that there's going to be continued clashes in the Donbass, but they will be low-key. The main way of going forward from the Russian point of view will be political and economic pressure.
Right. Professor Wang, your input here?
I think the Chinese perspective, my understanding is we should understand Ukraine's human rights in general, not just narrowly focus on the Crimea. I think to find your own development model to lift the livelihood of the whole Ukrainian people, these are the key challenges for the president of the Ukraine and the government of Ukraine.